Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Herbert Hoover, and the focus is fighting for the soul of America. The year is 1932. It's an election year, and as much as President Herbert Hoover wanted to ignore the politics and focus on the economic plight of the American people during this Great Depression, he did realize that this was a pretty important election. He said for the fact that this election was a turning point in American life and possibly in that of the world. This campaign is more than a contest between two men. It's more than a contest between two parties. It is a contest between two philosophies of government. The Democrats, the opposition party, pushing for a much more intrusive role of the federal government in trying to solve the people's problems, including in the economy. For Herbert Hoover, this was, frankly, American individualism, the American dream, and the American traditions were all at stake, and a limited role of the federal government. It's going to be a clear choice for the American people. Many Republicans weren't all that happy with Hoover as they went to their convention for the renomination that Hoover got on the first ballot, because they didn't really have an alternative. It had been a tough 4 years, but Hoover was still the leader of the party, and in fact, when he was listening on the radio in the Lincoln study in the White House and got the news, kind of matter of fact. Well, it was not wholly unexpected. He said, "Guess I'll go back to the office now." And he wanted to focus on the job much more so than the politics. The Democrats focusing very much on the politics, and they had three frontrunners going into their convention in Chicago. You had Al Smith, who had been the nominee 4 years before. Hoover had beaten badly. He was back in the mix. You also had John Garner, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he was behind some of those very aggressive economic measures, spend federal dollars to try to help the people that Hoover was vetoing, so he was getting his name in the mix. And then you had the New York governor, Franklin Roosevelt, a wealthy man fighting for the common man, that forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid, and a key role of the federal government in solving people's problems, according to Roosevelt on the campaign trail. Much of it regarding the current depression, I believe, could have been prevented by greater foresight and a larger measure of social planning. Of these other phases, that which seems most important to me in the long run is the problem of controlling, by adequate planning, the creation and distribution of those products which our vast economic machine is capable of yielding. Completely anathema to Herbert Hoover, this idea of social planning and central planning. That sounds like socialism or communism to him. Again, far be it from the traditions of the United States, but once again creating a pretty clear decision choice for the American people. FDR got that nomination on the fourth ballot at the Democratic Convention. As soon as John Garner sort of released his delegates, they all went over to Roosevelt, and then Garner got the VP nomination by acclamation almost immediately. Again, diametrically opposed role of government, but Franklin Roosevelt wasn't going to be held by traditions of whether it was politics, government, or even this thing like accepting the nomination. He did something that no one had done before. When he got the news, he got on an airplane, traveled 7 hours to Chicago, accepted the Democratic nomination in person, and he promised to break even more foolish traditions while pledging myself to a new deal for the American people. A new deal on one side, Herbert Hoover with more traditional American individualism on the other. Clear choice for the American people. Roosevelt launching his campaign, but Hoover had other problems at hand. Not only the economic depression, but now he's got an issue with veterans. If you go back to a previous decade, the veterans had pushed for bonus payments for their service in World War I, but Presidents Harding and Coolidge had both vetoed this. They thought it was too much money, not a good use of federal dollars, especially giving money to a sympathetic group, but an individual group didn't seem like the right answer to them. But Congress eventually overrode one of those vetoes from Calvin Coolidge, and the bonus payments were going to go into effect, but it was more of like a pension. Those bonus payments would not be delivered to veterans until 1945. Well, now in the 1930s, the Depression is underway. They want that money now. And so they were lobbying Congress to get that money. And Herbert Hoover continued to be like his Republican predecessors against making these individual payments. Well, the veterans did get a little bit of a benefit from the Congress, which allowed them to borrow against those future payments. Even though Hoover vetoed it, they passed it and overrode his veto in this case. But even for the veterans, this still wasn't enough. They wanted the payments, and they wanted them now. And they decided, sort of individually and then collectively, to have a march on Washington to make their point. They started gathering what became known as the Bonus March and the Bonus Expeditionary Force, with more than 10,000 veterans showing up up in Washington, D.C., setting up camps mostly on the other side of the Anacostia River outside the city limits, but some tents going up inside the city as well, including on that famous boulevard stretch, Pennsylvania Avenue, from the White House to the Capitol. You would see some of these veterans setting up their tents. Well, this was, again, creating a lot of tension for the Washington, D.C. police, which is the local police force, was actually responsible for security with all these veterans and protestations going on. This was, again, a very tense period. Congress is meeting in the meantime, and the House of Representatives actually passed what the veterans wanted. This is mid-June of 1932. The vote of 62 to 18 came, though, in the Senate against. So the Senate overwhelmingly rejecting this bid from these veterans. And Herbert Hoover was probably going to veto it anyway, even if it passed, but he was sympathetic, and he actually went to Congress and said, look, why don't we appropriate some money, maybe $100,000, to help pay for these veterans who did their service to the country to be able to travel home. They didn't have to pay for that. Congress passed this, and a bunch of the veterans actually took advantage of it. But about 5,000 veterans said, no, we're not going anywhere. We're going to continue to lobby to see if we can get these payments, and we can get them now. Things became tense in mid-July, where the D.C. police went to evict some of these veterans from a building that was going to be torn down. The veterans came in force from other parts of the city. There became a clash, and eventually shots were fired, and a couple of the veterans were actually killed. At this point, the D.C. government said, look, we can't hold the security on this anymore. We need help. Wrote a letter to the President of the United States asking for federal troops to come in and actually calm this situation. Well, this is not what Herbert Hoover wanted to do, but he did see it as his responsibility, and he gave guidance to the Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur. You got to clear these people out of the city, be very careful of any women and children who are in the groups, and just push them over the bridges outside the city limits. Don't go into those camps across the river. That's not necessary, but at least get them out of the city. MacArthur, who was aided by a couple of majors at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, George Patton, they're all here in Washington, D.C., he gave the orders on July the 28th to these veterans to disperse. About 3:45 in the afternoon, they didn't go anywhere. So about 5:30, he got a little more serious, and he brought in the troops. And for MacArthur, that meant infantry with bayonets. It meant cavalry with sabers drawn. It meant 6 M1917 light tanks. He wasn't messing around, and there was some initial resistance. So what did MacArthur do? Well, it became apparent that some hint must be given of the determination underlying the employment of federal troops in this contingency. This hint was given through the medium of harmless tear gas bombs. Well, maybe harmless to MacArthur, and maybe even to many of the veterans, although they didn't have gas masks and the Army soldiers did. But what did not appear harmless was the fact that the federal government and the U.S. Army was seemingly taking an attack to veterans of that army, with smoke going off, playing with monuments in the background. These were images that were frankly going to be devastating to the Hoover administration while all this was going on. Well, MacArthur got those veterans out of the city limits, across the bridges. He stopped, he gave his troops dinner, but then on his own initiative, he decided to finish the job. He took his soldiers across the river. There were torches set to the camps. Some might have been set by the veterans in protest, some by the Army. Needless to say, you had a lot more smoke, more tear gas, flames going up, the tents being burned down, the veterans being pushed out, and again, monuments in the Capitol in the background. These would be images that would play on newsreels across the country. Sure, the mission was accomplished. Herbert Hoover was not happy with MacArthur for basically exceeding his authority to go across those bridges. He rebuked him for that, but in the end, the mission was accomplished. No one was killed. In fact, no shots were fired, and Hoover was generally pleased, not yet aware of how devastating these images were going to be across the country. Somebody who was aware of that was Franklin Roosevelt. The Democratic nominee turned to one of his colleagues, Felix Frankfurter, and simply said, "Well, Felix, this elects me." Herbert Hoover was always angry at Roosevelt and the Democrats for the way that he was portrayed here in the bonus march activity in Washington, D.C. He would say later that not only did Roosevelt use the incident in the 32 campaign, but Democratic orators also continued to use it for 20 years after. Despite all the refutations and proof to the contrary, I was portrayed as a murderer and an enemy of the veterans. A large part of the veterans believe to this day that men who served their country in war were shot down in the streets of Washington by the regular army at my orders. Yet not a shot was fired or a person injured after the federal government took charge. But again, the messaging that came out, dominated by the Democrats, Hoover put in a very difficult light. Well, at this point, he's finally ready to engage in an aggressive campaign. As he believes, again, he is fighting for the soul of America in these two different philosophies of government. And over the last 6 weeks, he gave 8 major addresses. So you've got the affable FDR on one side promising a new deal for the American people. You had Herbert Hoover fighting for traditions and the soul of America. According to Hoover, he said that we have held that the federal government should, in the presence of great national danger, use its powers to give leadership to the initiative, courage, and the fortitude of the people themselves. But it must insist upon individual, community, and state responsibility to supplement and strengthen the initiative and enterprise of the people. The role of the people, the states, the municipalities, critical in this life of American individualism and the concepts of federalism and the separation of powers, all intrinsic to the federal government of the United States. But as far as FDR was concerned, no, he's got a New Deal plan. He's going in a new direction. And he attacked Hoover. The present leadership in Washington stands convicted, not because it did not have the means to plan, but fundamentally because it did not have the will to do so. I have charged that he did nothing for a long time after the Depression began, and I repeat that charge. Once more, it is a leadership that is bankrupt not only in ideals, but in ideas. And this message was resonating with the American people, many of whom thought it was definitely time for a change. Hoover kind of gave his last stand in a speech in a campaign event at Madison Square Garden in New York. Former President Calvin Coolidge came and spoke on his behalf, and Hoover continued to warn the people about FDR and this New Deal, which would put in danger all that they cherish. To enter upon a series of deep changes to embark upon this incoherent New Deal, which had been propounded in this campaign, would be to undermine and destroy our American system. But even Herbert Hoover at this point was realistic. Got on his train with his wife to go back to California to vote. He gave speeches along the way. He was basically exhausted. He also knew at this point he had little chance for victory. After all, we are opposed by 6 million unemployed, 10,000 bonus marchers, and 10-cent corn, he later said. Is it any wonder that the prospects are dark? Well, the election results in 1932 were a complete reversal from 1928. In that campaign, Hoover won 40 states. In 1932, he won 6. FDR won the Electoral College 472 to 59. Popular vote 57% for Roosevelt, only 40% for Hoover. And in Congress, the Democrats picked up over 100 seats in the House, another dozen seats in the Senate. They would have large majorities to support Roosevelt when he took over the presidency with his New Deal. Now look, the economy was really what this was all about. It had struggled throughout much of Hoover's term in office, unemployment now topping 23% during this election year, and not much else mattered to the American people. Now, Roosevelt was willing to try anything. He was offering this optimism, this personal quality, fighting for the forgotten man. Well, Hoover had a lot of political weaknesses. For all his strategic sense and his engineering ability to solve problems, he was really poor from the politics of things. He did very little to publicize all the work that he was doing, so that opened the door to the Democrats to basically say he wasn't doing anything. He didn't look or sound empathetic in the public. He didn't have good relationship with the press. None of his message was really getting through, in part because that self-promotion was never anything in his DNA, but it was costly politically. Charley Michelson, that man who had been sort of ghosting speeches against Roosevelt, or rather against Hoover for the last 4 years on behalf of the Democrats, he kind of put it this way. The contrast between the gloomy occupant of the White House, whom we referred to as the author of the Depression, and the vibrant Democratic candidate with his words of hope and cheer, well, Mr. Hoover's speeches, they were largely statistical. The theme being that the Depression was licked. The only thing that could stop the upward movement was the election of Roosevelt. The people made the opposite choice. They chose FDR going forward, but this was not over yet. Fighting for the New Deal, well, that was actually going to start during the interregnum, but that's the story for another day. That's Herbert Hoover and fighting for the soul of America from the life of Herbert Hoover. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.